My name does not matter anymore. What matters is what I wrote down in the back of my service notebook in the winter of 1911, the pages I never turned in with the official report. I served with the Royal Northwest Mounted Police, and I was sent into the Nahanni Valley to find 3 men who had gone north looking for gold. I came back. They did not. And what I found in that valley has kept me awake for the better part of my life. I am old now. My hands shake when I write. The doctor tells me my heart is tired, and I believe him. Before it stops, I want the truth to exist somewhere outside my own head. The report filed in Fort Simpson said the 3 prospectors most likely died of exposure and starvation, and that animal activity accounted for the condition of the remains. That report was shortened. It was sanitized. It was written the way our superiors wanted it written, because the truth would have caused panic among traders, trappers, and the families of men still working that country. I stood over what was left of that camp. I saw the marks on the bones. I saw the inside of that shelter dug into the side of the ravine. I saw the thing that lived there, with my own eyes, by the light of a failing lantern, and I knew at once that no bear had done what was done to those men. They had not simply died. They had been hunted, patiently, skillfully, by something that understood them better than they understood it. What follows is what I left out. I am setting it down now because I am the last of the 3 men who went in after those prospectors, and when I am gone, there will be no one left who saw it. If the man we tracked is dead, then the valley is quiet, and these pages will harm no one. But if he is not dead, then I want some warning to exist for the next man who walks into that country thinking the worst thing waiting for him is the cold. The Nahanni country had a name long before I ever set foot in it. Trappers spoke of it the way old sailors spoke of certain stretches of ocean, in low voices, with a kind of respect that did not sound like admiration. It lay far to the northwest, a long valley cut deep into the mountains by a river that ran fast and cold, even in the heat of summer. The walls of the canyons rose straight up out of the water in places, dark stones streaked with ice, and the spruce forests on the benches above were so thick that a man could walk through them all day and never see the sun directly. In those years, the talk of gold had reached as far as Edmonton. Men who had failed in the Klondike or arrived too late had begun to look further east into the mountains for new strikes. The Nahanni was rumored to hold rich ground. There were stories of nuggets the size of a thumb being washed out of small creeks, of veins of quartz in the cliffs. Most of those stories were lies told in saloons. But a man only needs to believe one of them to risk his life. 3 men believed. Their names appear in the official record, though I will not write them here, out of respect for the families who never recovered the bodies and never read the truth. I will call them only the eldest, the middle one, and the young one. The eldest had prospected in the Caribou and the Yukon. The middle one had worked in mines down in Montana. The young one was barely 20. They came up through Fort Simpson in the late summer, outfitted themselves heavily, and went into the valley with the intention of staying through the autumn and coming out before the river froze. They did not come out. By the first week of November, a trader at the post sent word south, relatives had written. A brother in Edmonton was asking questions. The men were overdue. The river was already running ice. If they were still alive, they were in trouble. If they were not alive, the bodies needed to be found before spring scattered them. The sergeant at our detachment called me in on a cold morning and laid the file on the desk between us. He did not need to ask. He simply said, "You and 2 others, as far as you can get before the river closes, and bring back whatever you find." The 2 others were good men. One was a tracker named Beaulieu, half French, half Métis, who had grown up in the bush north of Great Slave Lake. He could read a frozen creek bed the way another man reads a newspaper. The other was a constable named Harding, younger than me by a few years, steady, quiet, the kind of man who did not waste words and did not frighten easily. We left Fort Simpson with a small string of pack horses and enough provisions for 6 weeks. We did not expect to need them all. We expected to find 3 frozen men and to bring back what we could. We were wrong about almost everything. The valley took us in slowly. For the first 4 days the country was hard but ordinary. Snow lay shallow under the spruce. The river ran loud between the canyon walls. We saw moose tracks, wolf tracks, the prints of marten in the soft places. We saw nothing unusual. The horses moved well. Bolu sang quietly to himself in the evenings. Harding kept the fire and cooked our bacon. We slept easy. On the 5th day, we found the first camp of the missing men. It sat on a flat bench above a small side creek, a canvas tent still standing, sagging under a foot of old snow. A fire pit, long cold, full of clean ash. A pot hanging on a wire over the pit, with frozen beans still inside. 3 bedrolls laid out neatly. A rifle leaning against a tree. Tools, pans. A small leather pouch with tobacco still dry inside it. Nothing was disturbed. Nothing was taken. Nothing was broken. That was what was wrong with it. Men do not leave a rifle behind. Men do not leave good tobacco. Men do not leave a meal hanging over a fire. Bolu walked the perimeter of the camp twice without saying a word, then crouched down and put his bare hand flat on the ground next to the fire pit, the way he did when he was thinking. He looked up at me and shook his head once. He could find no tracks leading away. The snow around the camp told him nothing. Whatever had happened, the men had walked out, but they had walked out in different directions, and the snow had filled in their trails. That night we camped half a mile downriver from the tent. None of us said much. I noticed that Bolu kept his rifle within reach, even when he ate. So did I. In the morning we tried to hire 2 men from a small Dean camp we passed on the river to come further with us as guides. They refused. They would not even discuss the price. The oldest among them looked at me for a long moment, then said only, "That is not a place for you," and he turned away. We went on without them. The second camp we found was 3 days deeper into the valley. It was smaller than the first. The tent had been taken down and packed, but left in a neat bundle beside the fire. The fire had been built up large, then left to burn out. A coffee cup sat upright on a stone. A pencil lay on top of an open notebook. The notebook was blank on the page that was showing, but the page before it had 2 words written in a hand I did not recognize. The words were, "He watches." That was all. Bolu found the first prints that afternoon half a mile from the camp in a stretch of wet snow under a stand of spruce. He called me over without raising his voice. I crouched beside him and looked down at what he was looking at. They were the prints of a bare human foot, long, narrow. The toes spread wide, the way the feet of men spread when they have not worn boots in years. The arches were high, the heel struck deep, and the stride between them was wrong. I measured it with the haft of my hatchet. From one print to the next was nearly 6 feet. No man I had ever known could move through deep snow with a stride like that, not without running, and these prints did not run. They walked, long, smooth, even strides, as if the legs that made them were made for that country. In some places the prints were paired with marks that were not quite human, wider, pressed deeper on the outer edge, as if whatever made them sometimes went on all 4s, or as if there were 2 of them. We never decided which. That night the sounds began. It started after midnight, a high, thin call from somewhere up the slope above our camp. It rose and fell, like the cry of a loon, but loons do not winter in that country, and there was no water near enough. Harding sat up in his blankets and said, "Fox." Bolu said nothing. I listened to it for a long time. After a while the cry changed. It became the sound of a man laughing, not loudly, quietly, as if the man was just on the other side of the fire and did not want to wake us. I did not sleep again that night. None of us did. We sat with our rifles across our knees and watched the dark between the trees, and the laughter went on, off and on, until almost dawn. Then it stopped, the way a wind stops, all at once. And the silence afterward was worse than the sound had been. On the 8th day we came across a trapper. We had not expected to meet anyone that far up. He had a small cabin set back in a draw, hidden so well that we passed it twice before Bolu caught the thin smoke against the rock. His name was Klaus. He was old. He had been in that country since before the railway reached Edmonton, and he had the eyes of a man who had seen too many winters alone. He fed us. He gave us tea so strong it tasted of iron. He listened while I described the abandoned camps and the prints in the snow and the laughter on the slope above the river. He did not interrupt. When I finished, he sat for a long time looking into the small stove in the corner of his cabin. Then he said, "You should turn back." I told him we could not turn back. 3 men were missing. He nodded slowly, as if he had expected that answer. Then he began to talk. He told me there had always been stories about that valley. Some of them came from the Dean, and some came from the old slavey people before them, and some came from white trappers who had drifted up after the gold rush and never drifted back out. The stories did not always agree, but they shared certain pieces. There was a thing in the valley. Sometimes it was called the Wild Man. Sometimes it was called the one who walks behind. Sometimes it had no name at all, because to give it a name was to call it. He told me that long ago there had been men, real men, who went too far into the country and stayed too long. They lived on what they could kill. In winter, when nothing could be killed, they lived on what they could find. And when they could find nothing, some of them lived on each other. Those who survived such winters did not come back. The country kept them, and after a few years, they were no longer the men they had been. Their bodies changed. Their minds changed. They became thin and long and quiet, and they learned to move through the snow without leaving sign. They learned the sounds of every animal and every bird, and they learned to use those sounds to draw other men close. Klaus said that hunters had been disappearing from the upper valley for as long as anyone could remember. Not many. One every few years. Sometimes a pair. Always experienced men. Always men who should have known better. He said, "I do not tell you to make you afraid. I tell you so that when you see him, you will know him." I did not believe him. Not then. I wrote his words down in my notebook anyway, because that was my job. I wrote them in the back, where the official report would not see them. And when we left his cabin the next morning, he stood in the door and watched us go, and I remember thinking that he did not expect to see us again. We found the eldest prospector 4 days after we left Klaus. He was in a gully half a mile off the river. Beaulieu picked up the trail almost by accident, a torn piece of red wool caught on a branch at the height of a man's shoulder. The wool led us down through deadfall and over a small frozen stream and up the other side, into the gully where the spruce grew close and the snow was thin. He was lying at the base of a tree, with his back against the trunk, as if he had sat down to rest. His coat was gone. His boots were gone. His trousers were torn at the knees. His shirt had been opened down the front. The skin of his chest and his arms was gray and frozen, and most of the soft parts of him were missing. I have seen what wolves do to a body. I have seen what bears do. I have seen what a man does when he is starving and finds another man already dead. This was none of those things. The cuts on him were clean. They had been made with a blade, and the blade had been used the way a butcher uses a knife on an animal he has hung. The long muscles of his thighs had been opened along the bone and lifted out. The flesh of his upper arms had been taken in the same way. His belly had been opened and emptied. Whoever had done it had known where to cut. There was no waste in the work. Around him in the snow were the bear prints we had been following for days. They circled the tree where he sat. In several places they came up close, as if their owner had crouched there to watch the body. There were no drag marks. The meat had been carried away, not pulled. On the trees nearby, at the height of a tall man's head, there were marks gouged into the bark. They were not claw marks. They were the marks of a tool, hooked and dragged downward, the same way a man scores a tree to bleed it. 3 trees around the gully had been marked that way. The marks were old, years old, some of them. The bark had grown back around the edges. Harding turned away and was sick into the snow. Beaulieu said nothing for a long time. Then he looked at me and said, "This is not the first one he has done here." I knew he was right. The marks on the trees told me. The eldest prospector was not the first body that had been opened in that gully. He was only the most recent. We wrapped what we could find of him in a tarp and lashed it high in the branches of a tree, where wolves could not reach it. We marked the tree. We meant to come back for him. We never did. After the gully, we stopped pretending we were on a search. We were on a hunt. We did not say so out loud, but each of us knew. Beaulieu cleaned his rifle that night and oiled the action twice. Harding sharpened his knife until the edge could shave the hair off his forearm. I went through my notebook and tried to put together what we already knew, the way I had been taught to put together a case in Regina. I knew the prospectors had entered the valley in the late summer. I knew they had set up their first camp on the bench above the side creek and worked it for some weeks. The pans and tools we found there told me they had been washing gravel from the creek. I knew the second camp had been built in haste, 3 days deeper in, with the river behind them, as if they were moving away from something. The word in the notebook he watches told me they had known. I knew that somewhere between the second camp and the gully, the eldest had been separated from the other two. The condition of his body told me he had been taken alive, or nearly so. The marks on the trees told me he had been brought to that place on purpose, because that place was already a killing ground. I knew the man we were following did not live in either of the camps we had found. He had a place of his own. The prince went out from somewhere and came back to somewhere, and we had not yet found the somewhere. We found it on the 11th day. It was set into the side of a ravine 1/2 mile above the gully, in a place where the rock overhung, and the spruce grew so thick that even in winter the ground beneath stayed dim. The shelter had been dug back into the earth between 2 boulders, and the front of it had been covered with brush and hides until from 10 paces it looked like nothing at all. Beaulieu found it because a single thread of smoke thinner than a finger rose from a crack in the rock above it. The smoke had no smell of pine. It smelled of fat. We waited. We watched the entrance for the better part of an hour from cover, our rifles up, our breath held tight. Nothing moved. At last Beaulieu went forward with his rifle, and I went with him, and Harding stayed at our backs. Inside, the shelter was larger than it looked. A man could stand in the middle of it if he ducked his head. The floor was packed earth, swept clean. A small fire burned low in a pit lined with stones, and over it, on a frame of green sticks, strips of dark meat were drying in the smoke. I did not look at the meat for long. Along the walls, on shelves cut into the earth, were the possessions of dead men. There were pocket watches. There were 3 of them, 2 stopped, 1 still ticking. There were folding knives. There were spectacles. There were small leather wallets with names inside that I did not recognize, and one that I did, the name of a Hudson's Bay surveyor who had gone missing out of Fort Leard 9 years before. There were rings. There were a 6 rings, including a thin gold band that I would later return, in secret, to a widow in Edmonton who did not ask me where I had found it. There were teeth, a small tin box of them, human teeth. Some still had gold in them, and there were boots. Dozens of boots, worn through most of them but kept as if they were trophies. Beaulieu counted them aloud, quietly, and stopped at 23. We did not stay inside long. We could not. The air in there was thick with smoke and with something else. The smell of old blood and old fat and old fear, and I knew that if I stayed too long in that place, some part of me would not come out with me. We took the watch that was still ticking and the wallet with the surveyor's name, and we left everything else exactly as it was. Outside, the spruce stood quiet. The wind had dropped. And I understood, with a clarity I have never felt before or since, that we were being watched from somewhere very close. That night we did not light a fire. We camped 1/2 mile from the shelter, in a stand of small spruce where the ground rose toward a low ridge. We ate cold biscuit and cold bacon, and we drank water from our canteens. We set a watch in 3 shifts. Beaulieu took the first. I took the second. Harding took the third. None of us slept well in any of them. My watch began near 2 in the morning. Beaulieu shook me without speaking, pointed at the dark, and lay down. I sat with my back against a tree and the rifle across my knees. The night was clear. There was a 1/2 moon, and the snow under the trees held a faint blue light, and the silence was so deep I could hear the blood moving in my own ears. For a long time there was nothing. Then, on the ridge above our camp, against the moonlit sky, I saw him. He was standing perfectly still between 2 trees. He was tall in a way that was wrong. Not a giant, but stretched, as if his arms and his legs had grown too long for the body between them. He was thin. I could see the shape of his ribs through what he wore, and I could not tell at that distance whether what he wore was clothing or skin. His head was bent slightly forward, and his hair hung long around his face, and I could not see his eyes. I could only feel them. I knew, with a certainty that did not need proof, that he was looking directly at me. I did not move. I did not raise the rifle. Something in me understood that if I moved, he would be gone before the barrel cleared my knees. So I sat, and he stood, and we looked at each other across the snow for what felt like the better part of an hour, but was probably only a few minutes. Then he turned his head, slowly, as if listening to something behind him, and stepped backward between the trees, and was gone. He did not run. He did not crouch. He simply was not there anymore. I woke Beaulieu. I woke Harding. I told them what I had seen. Beaulieu went up to the ridge at first light and walked the line of trees where the figure had stood. He came back pale. He said there were prints up there, fresh. The same prints we had been following. But the prints did not lead up to the place where the figure had stood. They only led away from it, as if the figure had not arrived, as if it had only ever left. After that night, he did not leave us alone. In the morning we found that one of our packs had been opened in the dark, no more than 20 feet from where Harding had stood his watch. A tin of matches was missing. A small bag of salt was missing. A sheath knife of Beaulieu's, which he had laid on top of his pack when he lay down, was gone. None of us had heard a step. None of us had heard a breath. Harding swore on his mother's life that he had not closed his eyes. I believed him. That was what frightened me. We moved camp that day. We moved it again the next day. It made no difference. Each morning we found new prints in a circle around wherever we had slept. Some nights the circle was wide and lazy. Some nights it came in close, close enough that the prints crossed the rope line we had stretched between trees as an alarm. The rope was never touched. The prints simply went under it or over it without disturbing it at all. On the fourth night after the shelter, the whistles started. They began at full dark. A low whistle from the slope to our north. A moment later, an answering whistle from the slope to our south. Then one from the east, from across the river. Then one from the west, from up the valley behind us. They were not the calls of birds. They were the whistles a man makes by putting his fingers in his mouth, short and sharp, the way you might call a dog. They went on for hours. They came from 4 different directions, sometimes at the same moment. Harding said there were 4 of them. Beaulieu said there was 1 of them, and he moved. I did not know which was worse. On the 5th night Harding sat straight up in his blankets and pointed at a stand of trees no more than 30 feet from the fire, and he said, "Do you see him?" I looked where he pointed. I saw nothing. There was no figure between those trees. There was only the snow and the dark and the still spruce. Harding kept pointing. Tears stood in his eyes. He said it again. "Do you see him? He is right there. He is looking at us." I did not see anything. Beaulieu did not see anything. But Harding sat with the rifle aimed into those trees until the gray of morning, and would not lower it, and would not speak, and when at last the light came up enough to show that nothing was there, he laid the rifle down and wept like a child. He had not slept in 3 nights. None of us had. The man on the ridge was working us the way a wolf works a sick caribou. He was waiting for one of us to break before the others. We tried to leave on the morning of the 16th day. We had agreed in low voices by the dead fire that we had done what we could. The eldest prospector was accounted for. The other 2 were almost certainly inside the shelter we had found, or scattered around it in the snow in pieces too small to recognize. There was no longer any rescue to perform. There was only survival. We packed in silence, loaded what was left of our supplies, and turned the horses south. We did not get far. 2 miles down the river, where the canyon narrowed and the trail crossed a frozen side creek, the horses stopped. They would not go forward. Beaulieu was leading the first one. He pulled on the rein, and the horse set its feet, and its ears went flat against its skull. The other horses backed up against their leads. Beaulieu looked at me. He did not need to speak. He was on the trail ahead of us. We left the horses tied and we went forward on foot, the three of us, fanned out, rifles ready. The trail dropped down between two walls of rock and opened onto a small clearing on the edge of the frozen creek. He was standing in the middle of it. I saw him then in full light for the first and last time. He was a man, I want that to be clear. He had a man's frame and a man's face, but the country had been at him for a long time. He stood perhaps 6 feet tall, but he could not have weighed more than 120 pounds. His arms hung past his knees. His skin was the color of wet birch bark, gray and streaked with old smoke, and it lay so close over his bones that I could count the knuckles of his spine through the hide tunic he wore. His hair was matted into long ropes that fell past his shoulders, and his beard came down nearly to his belt. He had no boots. His feet were bare on the snow, and they did not seem cold. His eyes were the worst of it. They were a pale, washed-out blue, the color of ice on a shallow pond, and they were perfectly calm. There was no rage in them. There was no fear. There was no madness, not the kind I had seen in drunks and killers in the cells at Regina. There was only a long, slow attention, the attention of a thing that has watched men for so many winters that it no longer expects anything from them except that they will eventually lie down. In one hand he held a knife. It was a long blade, hand-forged, the handle wrapped in dark leather. I recognized the leather. It had been cut from a saddle. The eldest prospector had ridden a horse with a saddle of exactly that color until the horse had died and he had cached the gear under a tree we had passed 3 days before. In the other hand he held nothing. He did not need to. We aimed our rifles, all three of us. He looked at us the way a man looks at children. He did not raise the knife. He did not crouch. He simply stood, and the wind moved his hair, and behind him on the snow I could see the bare prints of his feet stretching back into the trees, and I knew, looking at them, that he had walked out of those trees to meet us on purpose. He had wanted to be seen. He had wanted us to know what he was, so that when we ran, we would carry the knowing with us, and we would tell it, and others would not come. Harding fired first. I do not blame him. He had not slept in days, and the sight of that face would have broken a steadier man. The shot went wide. The crack of it filled the canyon and came back twice off the rock walls. The man in the clearing was already gone before the echo finished. He did not turn and run. He simply stepped sideways into the tree line, 3 long strides, and the trees closed around him as if they had been waiting. Then he came back at us, from the side. I did not see him cover the ground. One moment the clearing was empty. The next, he was on Harding. He came in low and fast, under the level of the rifle, and the long knife went across the front of Harding's thigh, deep, opening the muscle to the bone. Harding screamed. Beaulieu fired and missed. I fired, and I believe I struck him, high on the left shoulder, because he turned hard with the impact, and a thin spray of dark blood marked the snow. He did not cry out. He did not even pause. He stepped back into the trees, and again he was gone. We did not chase him. We picked Harding up between us, and we got him back to the horses, and we ran. We ran the river south as fast as the country would let us. 3 days of riding through cold that cracked the leather of our boots, Harding tied to his saddle so he would not fall. The wound in his leg bound with strips torn off my own shirt, and going bad in spite of it. We came out at Fort Simpson on the 22nd day. Harding lived. He kept the leg, though he never walked easy on it again. Beaulieu went back to his people on Great Slave Lake and did not speak of the valley to anyone, that I know of, for the rest of his life. I wrote the official report at the desk of the sergeant, with the sergeant reading over my shoulder, and I left out almost everything that mattered. The report I signed said that 3 prospectors had been lost in the Nahanni Valley in the autumn of 1911, that the remains of one had been located and identified, that the remains of the other 2 were presumed to lie in the same district, and that wildlife and exposure were the most likely causes of death. The report mentioned, in a single line, the possibility of a transient trapper of unknown identity operating in the area. It did not use the word cannibal. It did not mention the shelter. It did not mention the boots, or the watches, or the box of teeth, or the marks on the trees in the gully. It did not mention the figure on the ridge. The sergeant read it twice. He looked at me for a long time over the top of his spectacles. Then he signed it without changing a word. He told me, quietly, that there were things the force did not need the public to read in the newspapers. He told me that men would still go into that country regardless of what we wrote, and that adding terror to their journey would help no one. He told me to file my notebook and forget it. I filed the notebook. I did not forget it. In the years that followed, I watched the records. I was posted to other places, but I kept track. In 1917, a trader and his son went up the South Nahanni after furs and did not come back. The search party found one of their canoes overturned on a gravel bar, and nothing else. In 1923, two brothers from Ontario went looking for gold in the same district their father had once worked. Their cabin was found the next spring intact, with the door open and a meal still on the table. In 1928, a man named M.C. Loud, of whom you may have heard, was found dead beside the river with his head missing from his body. The official report said wolves. I read that report. I knew better. The valley took its own. It had been taking them, I came to believe, for longer than any of us had records. Sometimes I wondered whether the thing we had seen in the clearing was a man at all, or whether he was something the country itself had grown, the way a tree grows a burl, around a wound that would not heal. Sometimes I wondered whether there had ever been only one of him. Clowes the old trapper had spoken of men, plural, who had stayed too long. I did not go back to ask him. By the time I tried, his cabin had burned, and no one in the country could tell me when, or how, or whether he had been inside it. I have not been back to the Nahanni. I am too old now, and I would not be welcome there even if I were young. But in my mind I have stood on that ridge 1,000 times. I have looked down at the camp below, at the 3 small figures by the fire, and I have understood what he understood. The wilderness can hide a man as completely as it hides a wolf. It can change him until he no longer wants to come out. And it can keep him, fed on whoever wanders into his reach, for as long as the river runs. If you are young, and you have heard the stories of gold in those mountains, I will not tell you not to go. Men have always gone, and men always will, and my words will not stop them. I will only ask that you do one thing. When the old people of that country tell you that some places are not for you, listen to them. They are not protecting their secrets. They are protecting you. Watch the ridges at dusk. Count your supplies in the morning. If you hear laughter on the slope above your fire, and there is no one there to laugh, put out the fire and move. Do not answer the whistles. Do not follow the tracks. If the man we tracked died in those mountains, then I can rest easy. But if he survived, the Nahanni still belongs to him, and he is patient. He has all the winter in the world.